This is Drew Karpyshyn. He probably hates people like me pronouncing his surname. Sorry, Drew. He's a writer, having crafted the Chaos-Born trilogy, which fantasy readers thought was okay. It was positively received without setting the world on fire. He also wrote some Star Wars books, which Star Wars readers thought were very good. And lastly, he wrote some video games, which gamers considered some of the best ever written. And the reason I've phrased it that way is why I've made this video in the first place. There are tiers to writing, based on the audience you garner with your writing and their expectations. Like many creatives who eventually transition to YouTube, I've written books in the past. I can write a decidedly average science fiction or fantasy tale that most people would deem acceptable but unremarkable. But when I turn that writing ability towards YouTube, I'm getting thousands of views and lots of likes and subscribers. Great. The crux of what I'm trying to point out here is that games writing is nearer the bottom rung alongside YouTube than at the top. It's an interactive medium that has struggled to gain artistic relevancy over the past few decades, but as time passes, we're seeing a gradual shift of perceptions, almost a sea change. Yahtzee Croshaw of The Escapist is an author too, and also talked about this recently. The focus in their video was how the storytelling aspects of gaming in general weren't being utilised to their full potential. In their case, they were talking about emergent storytelling using gameplay, and how the interactive living worlds constructed by games can tell a story of their own. That's all very well and good, and I agree, but it's not the focus of this video. I want to talk about traditional storytelling within gaming. While there are notable exceptions here and there, they really are the exception to both the perception of writing in gaming as a whole and the unfortunate level of quality we've been belaboured with. A large portion of the audience simply don't care about the quality of the writing and skip lengthy exposition, or they're simply too stupid to discern quality writing in the first place. Yeah, I said it. This means that the bar couldn't be much lower than it has already been set, and it's why many larger studios treat their audiences with contempt, because they're forced into appealing to the lowest common denominator and start to see that drooling idiot everywhere they go. The other issue with having a well-crafted traditional narrative is that it tends to enforce a degree of rigidity to the game, corralling the player in a limited direction in order to not mess up the stringent story beats, with many of them refusing any degree of player agency whatsoever by limiting the writing to cutscenes. You know the sort of game where a decent soundtrack and some good graphical design are all that separates the player from a rat in a maze that's occasionally rewarded with some cheese in order to keep going. So if you're a gaming studio with a limited amount of time and budget and most of your audience aren't even going to notice the writing quality, what motivation do you have to put out anything other than boilerplate plot by numbers? If you can just lead the prevailing chunk of your audience by the nose with the promise of dopamine hits, why bother trying to craft anything of substance? Well, if gaming is art, as it so desperately wants to be considered as, then the word craft is important. It implies a degree of care that's taken to creating art assets, and building worlds and designing the structure of levels, and this craft also needs to apply to the tale that the game wishes to tell the player. If we cast aside perception of audience and financial and corporate considerations for a moment, the unfortunate truth is that most development teams don't see the need for a dedicated writer in their staff. Sure, there are writing jobs, but they're largely filled by hacks who couldn't make it elsewhere, or developers who absolutely believe that the story they're telling is fantastic, but it isn't. I've applied for a lot of strange positions in my life, including six-figure executive roles at various companies, and this slew of applications includes writing roles at Obsidian, BioWare and Larian. Looking back on those applications, they're positions that I certainly am in no way qualified for. I'd do a workmanlike or passable job at best because I have some of the skills, but if I'd been given the role, I'd merely be filling a spot that someone far more capable wouldn't get a chance to truly excel in. That's what's happening in a lot of these creative roles in the gaming industry, and it's to the detriment of the craft and the long-term profitability of the games, where it's not someone with imposter syndrome who gets the position, but someone who blagged their way into the role but doesn't have a talent to back it up. Thank you, gaming recruitment people. You're doing such a great job. Some studios have tried to address that very issue, so clearly it's not an unknown one, but just because you hire a professional writer doesn't mean it's a slam dunk. Richard K. Morgan is a fantastic acclaimed writer who I've read many books from. He tried his hand at video game writing, and his efforts for Crisis 2 and Syndicate were both criticised. One for putting an open world series more on the rails, and the other for being bland and boring. After releasing a game book, Morgan hasn't returned to writing for gaming, and I can't say I blame him. What this implies to me is that writing books can give you skills to write for games and vice versa, but despite their similar skill sets, they're two different disciplines. Much like how writing for television and film isn't the same as being a literary giant either. But if gaming isn't recognised for its incredible storytelling and large chunks of its audience skip over any flavour text that gets in the way of their gameplay, then how on earth are game writers going to garner any respect within the industry? How can the writing quality of a game become as paramount to its success as the mechanics or graphical design? Well, in some genres, writing is much more important than others. Like in point-and-click adventure games, cinematic gaming akin to interactive movies, or old-school role-playing games. The latter is where our writer at the beginning of a video comes from, and it's simultaneously the most rewarding and most difficult arena to showcase great writing in. As I've mentioned before, with most games that require a story, cutscenes can suffice, and it's where writers like Brianna Pratchett excel, because within that stringent setting their narrative stylings can flourish. But if we look at two of the biggest games in that narrative-heavy cutscene genre over the past decade, we find some uncomfortable results. The Walking Dead was a critically acclaimed graphical adventure game based on the comic series. It was written by Sean Vanneman. Life is Strange was a stunning teen drama in the same genre written by Christian Devine and Jean-Luc Cano for French studio Dontnod. They both feature some of the strongest stories and writing seen in gaming for a very long time. But what happened to those writers? Vanneman worked with Brianna Pratchett actually on Rise of the Tomb Raider as a story consultant, and helped write Firewatch with 3 other writers. Those were some pretty big games. Clearly his success with The Walking Dead has set him up in the industry for, what's that? He hasn't been involved in anything since 2016. Devine apparently works as lead writer for Techland Games these days if his Twitter is to be believed, but you couldn't tell based on his credits. He wrote the Life is Strange prequel and sequel and free spin-off game, but hasn't been credited for anything outside of that, and hasn't been seen in a narrative-heavy game since. Cano is the same, involved in the prequel, but after that, nothing. Where am I going with this? Well, you can write some of the greatest stories in gaming, tales that are renowned both critically and commercially, and still not land a position where you can follow up on that creativity long term. In the gaming world, words are treated poorly and so are writers. In the role-playing arena, it's a different beast entirely, because the choice and consequence and branching narrative paths mean that you're not just writing for a specific scenario, but for a multitudinous amount based upon character affiliations, reputations within factions, and previous events. The standard bearer for this complex weaving of tales is Fallout New Vegas, an entirely open-world game with multiple factions and the ability to kill or spare absolutely everybody in the environment. It's not just the freedom and atmosphere and post-apocalyptic setting that's important within this game, but the ever-shifting consequences of being you that makes it so remarkable. Where a decision that you made 40 hours ago complicates a quest due to your unsavoury reputation, or a security check is inexplicably solved by you being mentally challenged due to your head injury and blurting out the word ice cream. And it's that kind of dedication to both the enormous number of what-if scenarios that a narrative-heavy open-world environment can throw at you, and to rewriting large portions of the dialogue to cater to low-intelligence exclusive playthroughs that endears people to the game 12 years out from release. Because it's something that the vast majority of players wouldn't see, but respects and rewards those few who endeavour to find out or happen upon it by chance. To sum up the importance of writing and the kill your darlings nature of it all, let's look at one of the most high-profile examples, The Witcher 2. At the end of Act 1, you're given a decision to side with one of two characters, Roach or Yorvith. In most narrative-heavy games, the result would mean complications with factions later in the game based on that choice. And in The Witcher 2, that's no exception. But your choice here is more important than you realise. It changes the entire second act of the game. There's an entire third of the game that becomes inaccessible to you based upon this choice. That includes maps and characters and quests. Not only were the writers of The Witcher 2 crafting a story that almost half the players most likely wouldn't experience, but the development team were also in agreement over this and designed twice as many levels for that select player base to adhere to the writer's decision. When compared to a railroaded Telltale game, where no matter what choices you make, things always seem to end up heading in the same direction, that's an enormous difference, and requires a similarly enormous amount of effort on the part of the team overall. But that's what happens when you have a writing and design team that care about their work. They're willing to go that extra length to see their vision through to the end. And players appreciate that effort when they come across it because it differs so significantly from what they're used to seeing. When gaming writers of a different caliber are afforded the opportunity to tell their stories, it overrides any foibles from the design team or graphics department. There's a captive audience that's quite clearly willing to put up with poor design and limited art if the strength of a narrative is exceptional, and they're not being catered to for the most part. And while gameplay can be superseded and forgotten about in the preceding years, if a game has a superlative story, that will age far better than the trappings used to tell it. As I've said in the past, gaming is escapism for so many, and a power trip too, where you're in control of the avatar or character and their actions. And while you can craft engines and mechanics that allow the player to experience that, a reactive story that respects player choice will provide an even more immersive experience. So while I don't have much hope that writing will gain the respect it deserves to those who operate in the industry, who don't understand the craft and are more interested in chasing short-term profits than creating a long-term legacy, I hope that one day the exceptions to the rule will become less the exception and more the standard that should be upheld. Do you like me waffling on into a microphone? Apparently I do it a lot. I've hundreds of videos on the channel. Feel free to take a look, and if you like what you see, you can always subscribe. Until next time.